Thank you very much for the introduction. Can everybody hear me at the back? Okay. I was also told that when I start the talk, I should ask everybody to sit down, and we're not supposed to have people not on chairs. Okay. So the title of my talk is Visual Foundation Models for Embodied Applications. And can everybody see this? And on Zoom, I wonder if everything is...
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, so first, before diving in, let's talk a little bit about the vision that we share at TRI. So our goal is to create new technologies that are going to enable Toyota products, existing products and future products to improve quality of life, both for individuals and for society as a whole. And TRI is structured into a number of different teams and divisions, each addressing a different fundamental challenge. The computer vision team, which I lead, is part of the robotics division. And as a computer vision team, of course, we're in the business of training visual representations. And the idea is that we take these representations once they're trained, and then we plug them into various downstream applications. And of course, we aim to find the best kind of representations that will then enable quick adaptation and eventually generalization to any kind of downstream task that we care about. And so, of course, there are many different ways to train visual representations. And over the years, we focused on a few key properties, which we think are important for visual representations to enable downstream applications. The first thing that I'm going to talk about is understanding 3D structure. And here what I mean is, given some set of sensory data, typically an image or a set of images, we want to encode these into a latent space from which we want to be able to decode the geometry of the scene or the 3D structure of the scene. And not just decode, we want that to be metric because we want embodied agents to use these quantities basically to operate in the field. The second thing I'm going to talk about, the second key property is motion. And motion is a rich signal for learning, not just for ML models and embodied agents, but also for humans. And it's key to how the brain develops and how we learn to perceive and understand the world. And if embodied agents are to be successful in interacting with the real world, they should be able to understand things like static versus dynamic, concepts like object permanence, making predictions about the future, and so on. The third property is this idea that representation should be object-centric, and we believe that objects are a useful abstraction in thinking about the world. And object-centric representations basically allow us to use perceptual content for action and for symbolic cognition. And modeling these objects with high accuracy is also important for embodied agents in the sense that if you learn to do an operation on a particular object with a particular geometry, then transferring that to similar objects with similar properties should be easier if you have a nice, well-behaved object-centric representation. And finally, I'll also talk about the interpretability very briefly. We would also like these representations to be explainable and interpretable, and we would like to understand what they learn, what they miss, and where we should correct things so that we get them to behave the way they should. Okay, so the talk is going to have 4 broad chapters, and I'll dive into 3D structure, which is the first one. So the ability to learn 3D perception from cameras has been a key research direction in our team for many years. And in particular, we focus on depth estimation, which is a fundamental challenge both for driving and for robotics, where basically agents need to be able to interact with the world, which is 3-dimensional, from just images, which are basically 2D arrays of faces. And so learning how to predict depth from single image is an ill-posed problem, but we have centuries of geometric priors, which we can leverage direct supervision and self-supervision to be able to train these networks. And so what we normally do is we use camera models and projected geometry and multi-point consistency to apply top-down supervision and train these bottom-up networks so that they can learn to infer and predict depth from a single image or from a set of images, depending on the situation. And so I just want to spend a little bit talking about how this works in the self-supervised setting, which is something we spend quite a bit of time looking at. Basically, what we have is no microphone, but it's okay. People in Zoom maybe cannot hear, but maybe people at the back can hear. All right. Is it working?
No.
Yeah. Is it not working? It's
No,
working.
no, it's working. Yeah.
All right. So basically what we have is a sequence of images which is captured by a moving camera. And what we want to do is we want to derive some kind of self-supervised loss where we don't have to use labels or annotations, which are usually more suited to capture and so on, and require hardware and things like that. So what we do is we take 2 consecutive frames from the sequence. We use one to predict the geometry of the scene, and then we use 2 consecutive frames to predict the equal motion. And then we can use these 2 quantities to basically derive loss by reprojecting pixels from one camera to the next and taking a photometric difference. And this actually works surprisingly well in practice, and we published a long list of papers. This is just a subset on this topic, and this line of work is led by Vitor Ghizzellini, who is a research scientist in my team at TRI. And basically, up until 2022, we focused mostly on the self-supervised aspect of things. And we basically proposed new architectures, new losses, extensions to different camera models. We've also looked at different downstream tasks, and so on. And we've pushed the boundaries of what's possible with self-supervised learning to the point where in some situations, with some assumptions, self-supervised methods are even better than supervised methods, basically. And so what we see on the left over there is a typical output of a system like this. The top left is the input image, and then we have the predicted depth, and then we have the point cloud right next to that. And it's this is actually HD, and it captures most of the details, the structural details of the scene. Code and papers and all that are available on GitHub as well. And so we've also looked at combining self-supervision with different downstream tasks. So we used simulation heavily to generate data for tasks for which annotations are expensive, like semantic segmentation. And so while it's easy to generate this with simulation if you have the right simulator, there is a domain gap, which is an issue when trying to transfer these methods to the real world. And what we found is that self-supervised learning basically proves to be surprisingly effective in overcoming this domain gap when we combine it with synthetic data sets. So what we show here on the bottom right is a GIF from GUDA, one of our methods, where we basically train a semantic segmentation network in simulation. We combine that with self-supervised learning in the real world, and we minimize this domain gap. We also looked at combining depth estimation with 3D object detection, and we saw that this helps improve performance, particularly on tasks which have fewer labels, so pedestrians and cyclists. And this is a snapshot from DD3D, one of our papers from CVPR24. And this line of research is, of course, useful in theory because we can derive self-supervised losses without any kind of ground truth. It's also useful in practice. And here are some examples of where we ran this method and some of the common use cases that we're looking at. This is an example of a static camera, and we're trying to find the pedestrians. There's a more challenging scene with a snow-covered street. We also looked at more extreme situations, like this motorcycle, sort of an extreme sports scenario. Here, there's a collaboration with the robotics, one of the other teams within the robotics division, where we basically run monolith inside a very small range, inside a bubble gripper that the robot is using to basically push against some object. And finally, this is one of my favorites. We also ran this method underwater, and we're reconstructing basically part of the seafloor. And we can do that because one of our methods estimates the deformation of the lens. And so actually underwater, you get all these interesting deformations. And it worked. And so the question is, or one of the questions is, have we solved all of the relevant issues in 3D perception? And sadly, no, there are a few limitations that remain. In most cases, these resulting models and the predictions are unscaled. And this is sort of a byproduct of learning on videos, where you basically learn quantities that are sort of arbitrarily scaled or unscaled. A second limitation is most of these methods are trained for a particular domain. So you want network for outdoors, network for indoors, different situations. They also tend to overfit to camera models and so on. And the third is they don't really output uncertainty, at least not in our the methods that we looked at. And so in 2023, we transitioned from the more typical sort of CNN style approach, where we have one image as input and one depth map as output, to training implicit representations, also called neural fields. And this was also inspired by recent breakthroughs at the time in neural radiance fields, light fields, and so on. And so the way these words function is we first encode available information into a latent representation, and then we can query this latent representation from any new viewpoint to generate the estimates that we care about. And what we found is that these implicit representations are much more flexible than CNNs, and also much more efficient. And so I'm going to very briefly talk about 3 recent papers and their main highlights. And I'll mention that they're all based on the perceiver architecture, which we like because it's very efficient at encoding and then decoding lots of different types of data. Okay, so the first method I'll talk about is called define, which is short for depth field networks. And what we looked at over here is how to encode multi-view geometry, or how to learn multi-view geometry implicitly in the neural net. And over here, instead of enforcing geometric constraints, such as cost volumes or bundle adjustment and things like that, we let the network learn these constraints or correlations directly from the data itself. And what we do is we use knowledge about the camera extrinsics and intrinsics to create these geometric embeddings which are passed to the network along with the images. And what happens is these embeddings condition a latent space, which is a global latent space shared across all the samples, across all the data set. And once we condition this latent space at inference time, we can basically decode it from new viewpoints and obtain, in this case, depth estimates. And what we show here is a nice visualization where basically we have 2 gray cameras. Those are used to condition this latent space. And then we have a red viewpoint, which is moved around. And from that red viewpoint, we decode novel depth views, which we wouldn't have been able to do with CNN, where you basically take as input one image or a set of images, and then you decode what corresponds to them. Another cool thing about this is that it basically takes about 5 milliseconds to decode one of these novel views once we've encoded them, because the perceiver architecture is very useful at these kind of tasks. The next method I'll talk about is called Delira, and I'm staying very high level over here, but obviously there are many technical details in getting these to work properly. So Delira stands for depth, light, and radiance field, and we made 2 main contributions over here. The first is we show that the self-supervised photometric objective can be used to improve volumetric rendering. And basically what happens is this helps fix the shape radiance ambiguity that's sort of an issue with radiance fields. So for those of you who are familiar with nerves, you know that if you have just 3 views of a scene, for example, or 2 views, then you can encode them into a latent representation from where you might be able to render nice images, but the geometry is usually very, very poor. So it turns out that when you use self-supervised photometric consistency, you can render new views and add additional information and constrain this latent space so that the geometry actually looks much better. And the second contribution is we basically decoded from the same latent space multiple tasks. We looked at depth rendering, so depth fields, light fields, and also radiance fields. So that's photometric rendering for one task and single gray rendering for multiple tasks. And finally, zero depth is a very recent method. Here we move back to monocular depth estimation, and what we want to do is we want to tackle scale ambiguity. And so in addition to that, and unlike our prior works here, the latent space is also variational, which means that we can then get estimates with uncertainty. So what that means is we keep the mean and the standard deviation, and then we can sample multiple times from the latent space. And so we trained zero depth on a combination of data sets, and we found that we achieved zero-shot transfer to multiple domains, which is very good. And to conclude this first part of the presentation, I just want to highlight zero depth and the fact that the code is basically available online. We think of it as a foundation model for generating 3D structure from images, because you can basically run it zero-shot across multiple domains. You get metric depth, and it's very easy to use. You just load your image with intrinsics, you pass them to the network, and then you get the depth map and the uncertainty estimates. And so I guess to conclude this section, If there's anybody out there who's using just 2D images, you should give 3D a try, because you can basically just get it for free with these kind of networks, and they're getting better and better at operating zero shot across multiple domains. Okay, so that wraps up part one. I'll move on to part two, which is motion. So changing gears a bit, I'm sure we've all seen all the impressive recent results in 2D segmentation, and in particular the segment anything model, where you basically click anywhere on an image and the model gives you back a pretty good 2D segmentation of that part in that image where you clicked. And so the question that we asked ourselves is, what about tracking? Do we have something that's similar and that works as well for tracking? And sadly, no, or maybe I should say not yet. Basically, what we want to do is we want to indicate any target in the video, a point, a box, a mask, and we want the system to just be able to track that over the video. And so instead of a general system like that, what we have is a series of these bespoke solutions for different types of inputs and outputs. We have something called star for boxes, we have masks for masks, and then we have pips for points. And they all work great for their particular task until you get into a situation where basically they don't work so well anymore. And one of the intuitions behind the limitations is the fact that these pixel-sized entities, like we see in the image over there on the bottom right, basically grow to be full regions. And so if you have a tracker that tracks points, by the time you get to the third image, maybe it's not going to work as well. Then a second issue with existing methods is, perhaps by design, this idea of an information bottleneck. So if you think about this image on the left, what the tracker actually sees is this associated correlation map, which is what's correlated from the first image and the second image. And because most methods reason on this kind of compressed representation, they miss out on crucial information. So what happens here, in fact, is the horse is not going to go forward. It's going to have to jump over the fence, because obviously there's a fence, but the tracker doesn't see that. And so it's not very good at estimating this kind of nonlinear motion. And this is a serious limitation in some cases. Maybe a similar analogy is if you think about the rat in a maze. When the rat hits a wall, it's going to have to turn left because it can't go forward anymore. But the tracker doesn't really have access to that information. It just sees where the mouse was before, and so it tries to learn and predict something based on that. So this is kind of a limitation. And building upon these two intuitions, we propose TAG, which stands for Tracking at Any Granularity. And this is a work that's currently under review, so it should drop on archive one of these days, but the paper is up on GitHub. I'll have the link later. And this work is led by Adam Harley from Stanford. It's a collaboration between TRI, CMU, and Stanford. And this slide basically shows some of the cool results of the method. Red is the estimate, and green is the ground truth. It works on a wide variety of domains, zero shot, and I'll go into some of the technical details, but keep things at a high level. Basically, we think of TAG as a foundation model for tracking, or more generally for understanding motion, because it unifies a bunch of different paradigms into one umbrella. And the key idea is basically that we treat all targets as boxes with optional masks. And we see here input videos and the corresponding ground truth next to them. And basically the way it works is, at its core, TAG is just a massive transformer. So for this method, we went with a tried and tested recipe of deep learning, which is we simplify the architecture, we operate directly on the pixels, which we expect to solve some of the issues that I mentioned. The model then outputs 5 different types of predictions, and we supervise whichever one we have ground truth for. And then the second ingredient of the tried and tested recipe is, of course, data, lots of data, and Adam has led a valiant effort to collect basically all the tracking data sets that he could find, so we could train on them. And the image on the right basically shows the list of these data sets. The total comes to somewhere around 24 million frames with different kinds of labels, as we show over there. And so we find that TAG learns to estimate uncertainty in a very nice and sensible way. So you see on the bottom the uncertainty of the key points flares up when the key points get occluded, which is very nice to see. We also find that DAG learns accurate nonlinear motion during occlusions. As we see the key points on the robot on the left or on the bunny on the right, and the way they move. And basically, to conclude this method, DAG is it unifies a few different tracking paradigms, and thanks to its flexibility and the fact that we train on this massive amount of data, it gets us one step closer to what we want, which is this system where you can just click on something, you can or draw a box around something, and then it just works and it tracks what you want. Or in other words, it's a foundation model for understanding motion. And this video should play. These are some more results of the method and what we track in different situations. So this is all thanks to Adam and finding all these data sets and putting them together. All right, so the code should be available very soon at that link, and the paper is currently under review, but it's going to be available on the website. All right, so that wraps up part 2. Next, I'm going to talk about this idea of object-centric representations. And first, I want to talk about representing objects with 3D neural networks. And the way we think about this in the work that we've done is we start from a set of meshes, like you see over here, in this case, a set of cars. And what we want is we want to represent each one of these shapes with a vector which lives in a high-dimensional space. And we want this space to promote some kind of interesting or useful property like smoothness or compression or reusability and so on. And here's an example of such a latent space, courtesy of Sergei Zakharov, who is a research scientist in the vision team at TRI and in this room. And basically what happens here is there's a red dot that moves across this latent space, which is represented as a sphere. And whenever it reaches one of the points on the sphere, it gets decoded into the corresponding shape. And you see we get nice smoothness, and everything is projected onto this sphere. And here's a second example from another paper from a couple of years ago, Chapeau, where we applied a similar idea to indoor objects, and we also modeled colors. And so we applied these learned latent object spaces to a few different applications. So we looked at auto labeling in outdoor environments, as shown on the left. We also looked at auto labeling in indoor environments, as in the bottom center over there, where we basically find and reconstruct novel shapes. And in both of these cases, the way this works is we make an initial guess about what's in the scene. We then compare the guess with what we observe, so what's in the image or the depth map if we have it, and then we iterate until we find something that best matches the image. And so this process is called analysis by synthesis. It's similar to a cognitive process in the brain, and it resembles the way the brain perceives and understands speech and language. Finally, we also look at scene reconstruction. So unlike monodepth and predicting 3D structure, here we also predict the occluded, the invisible parts of objects, because these object spaces encode complete shapes. So we can reconstruct what's not visible as well. And so despite these many downstream applications, one challenge remains, or many challenges remain, but one in particular that we looked at is how to obtain an expressive latent space where we can efficiently and accurately encode lots of different shapes of lots of different classes. And the state-of-the-art methods in this field basically offer an interesting trade-off where you can model one shape extremely accurately, or you can model many different shapes not so well. And so this is something that we looked at, and in our paper, ROAD, that stands for Recursive Object Autodecoder, we tried to address these limitations, and we proposed a differentiable lightweight network that stores multiple shapes and then recovers high-fidelity geometry in real time. And what we see on the slide are a bunch of shapes which we can encode with the same network, and then we can decode decode them as well, and we have very, very high accuracy in terms of the geometry that's stored. And the key to our approach is the fact that this representation is recursive by design, and it allows us to efficiently and accurately encode large data sets of complex shapes. And the way ROAD works is we learn hierarchically structured latent space, and we use an octree representation which we traverse iteratively, going from a coarse level to a finer and finer level. And so each shape in this work is parameterized by a single latent vector, which denotes the root node of an octree. And what we do is then we traverse this octree recursively up until we reach a predefined level of detail. And what I show over here is how this works in 2 dimensions, where we use occupancy prediction to prune unoccupied cells, and then we continue expanding the occupied cells until we reach where we want to get. And then we extract the shape. And similarly, this is how it works in 3D, where we basically keep iterating through this octree, and we use the same network at all the levels. So all of the latents that are stored in the octree get projected into the same latent space. And here we see this expansion or traversal of the octree, and the fact that the encoded shape gets finer and finer in terms of the geometry captured. So some of the nice properties of ROAD is we managed to achieve 99% compression compared to the input shapes. And at the same time, we also managed to achieve very high reconstruction accuracy, and this is thanks to the fact that the network is basically recursive and is designed to be efficient in its implementation and reuse geometric primitives. So what we show in this GIF is basically iterating through a bunch of these shapes. Each one starts on latent vector, and then we keep recursively expanding the octree, and we get to finally the shape that's decoded. We also did an analysis of what happens in this latent space. So like I mentioned, each shape is parameterized by a single vector, but then each part of the shape as we traverse the octree is similarly parameterized by a latent vector. And we projected all of them in the same latent space, and we tried to see what the configuration looks like, and it turns out that the network learns to reuse geometry at different scales. As you go from coarse to fine, the geometries become represent smaller and smaller parts of objects, and the network learns to use them interchangeably for different shapes. And that's what leads to this very high degree of compression. There were a couple of limitations here. We basically only encoded SDF signals, and we used a discrete structure. We used an octree, which meant that we couldn't encode continuous signals, which is something that we would want to do, particularly if we want to encode something that's represented as a field or a radiance field in particular. And so, of course, these are the limitations we address in our follow-up work, and this is called REFINE. It stands for Recursive Field Networks. What we want to do here is represent many shapes, again in a lightweight model, and we want to represent them with high accuracy. And unlike ROAD, what we want to be able to do here is represent multiple signals continuously, so not just SDFs, and we want to be able to capture colors as well. And this paper is just freshly released on arXiv and is going to be presented in CGraph, I think in a few weeks. So how does REFINE work? I'll go to a nice GIF that shows the method. Like ROAD, we start from a root latent, and then we pass it to a recursive network, which keeps expanding this octree until a particular level of detail. And then, unlike ROAD, we now support continuous trilinear interpolation. So we take latents from 3 different levels, we fuse them, and then we pass these to 2 different networks that decode them into the quantities that we want to represent. So in this case, geometry as SDF and color. So it sounds easy, trilinear interpolation in Fusion, but actually, in this case, the devil is in the details and keeping track of all of these free and empty cells in this octree data structure, and being able to do this in a bug-free way is actually quite tricky. And so once we interpolate a latent, we can decode it to any signal as you saw on this slide. And so with REFINE, we can basically represent entire data sets, in this case with colors as well. And we think of REFINE as a foundation model for 3D shape representation. And we are going to release multiple models that encode various commonly used datasets. And we think that we are going to start in the future from a model like this and use it to extract the shapes as opposed to downloading the datasets, because the quality of reconstruction is very, very high. And in particular, we recently trained Refine on Observer's LD split, which is 10,000 objects. And the size of the network was 290 megabytes compared to the size of the dataset, which is 360 gigabytes, I think, including the textures and everything. So that's quite a significant reduction in terms of space. In this case, the reconstruction accuracy isn't as high as in the other datasets because this is much larger, but we're working on that, and we hope that in the future we'll basically be able to, swap out datasets for something like this that encodes all of the shapes, and we can then extract them and use them differentially in pipelines like auto labeling and finding objects and reconstructing them in real scenes. Okay, and very briefly, I'm going to talk about interpretability, which is the fourth chapter of this talk. So we, from the early days of the team, we have treated videos as first-class citizens, and we've learned from them. And one question that we asked ourselves is, what do video transformer models learn? And it turns out that there aren't actually many papers that look at interpretability for transformers or for video transformers in particular. And this is basically what we propose in our paper, VTCD, Understanding Video Transformers via Universal Concept Discovery. And this was led by Matthew Cowell, who is a PhD student at York University and is actually going to be presented as a highlight in this conference. And so a very, very high-level overview of the method is it consists of three different components: concept discovery, concept importance, and concept analysis. So for concept discovery, we basically take a set of videos, we pass them to a video transformer, and we obtain intermediate representations, Z, which we then cluster with slick or simple iterative linear clustering, and we obtain tubelets. We then repeat this process for several videos in dataset, and we obtain a dataset of tubelets. We then cluster these tubelets, and we obtain concepts. Next, what we want to do, given a set of concepts extracted over a data set of videos, is be able to rank these concepts and say which ones are more important with respect to model performance. And so what we do is we perform this concept discovery process for all the heads and all the layers of these transformer models, and we obtain more concepts. And then to calculate their importance, we do Monte Carlo sampling, and we randomly mask multiple heads simultaneously while computing the drop-in performance. And after several rounds of masking, the final concept importance is the averaged drop in performance over all the masks. So there's many technical details in the paper, and we tried a few different ways of computing the importance. It was quite difficult to disable concepts that were in particular heads and actually see a correlation with respect to performance. This finally worked quite well for us. And so at the end of this step, we were able to correlate concepts with model performance and say, if we remove this particular concept, this much performance drops. And we looked at a few different models that I'll talk about in a second. So using these concepts, we looked at a few different transformer models, and we tried to figure out what are the most important concepts and what do they do. And so we looked at the segmentation TCAL model, which is trained to track occluded objects on the Kubrick dataset. And the most important concept is found in layer 5. It tracks the target objects as well as objects with similar appearance. And so this suggests that the model learns to solve the disambiguation problem by first identifying possible distractors that are similar to the target object that we want to track. The second most important concept for this model was in layer 9, and it tracks the target object throughout the video. We also looked at the most important concept for the supervised video MAE model, trained for action recognition on something V2 for the class of dropping something into something else. And so the most important concept was at layer 11. It tracks the object being dropped until the drop occurs, after which it tracks the container. And the second most important concept was found at layer 8, and it captures the container without the object. Finally, the third most important concept was similar across these two models. It is temporally invariant, which suggests that positional information processing occurs in the early layers of both of these models. So we found it interesting that these models that are sort of quite different in the way they're trained share some concepts, and this led us to ask the question, are there more concepts which are shared by these models and indeed more video transformer models? And are there concepts which are universal across similar models? And we were inspired by this Rosetta Neurons paper, and we tried to discover what's called Rosetta concepts. And the way this works is we looked at 4 different models: the segmentation model I mentioned, action recognition, self-supervised, and video language. And we identified these Rosetta concepts by looking at the IOU of the tubelets for a given concept. And if this IOU is above a certain delta threshold, then we consider this concept to be universal across all 4 models. And we also looked at subsets. And so, interestingly, we found quite a few similar or universal concepts. Here's one that's shared by all models. It captures rolling objects. And we found quite a few others. So in the early layers, we found spatially and temporally invariant position concepts. In the middle layers, we found object-centric representations that capture rolling objects and hands. And in the deeper layers, we found spatial-temporal object-centric representations that capture objects or containers before dropping objects. So it was very interesting to see that these kind of object-centric representations emerge and are shared by all of these models, despite all of them being trained, or none of them really being trained for this particular type of signal. Okay, and so to find more information about this paper, you can go to the website or the archive link, or come to our poster later during the conference. All right, so that comes to the end of the talk, and we basically talked about 4 different key properties of these visual representations. We looked at 3D structure, we looked at understanding motion, we looked at object-centricness of these representations, and we talked about interpretability. And in particular, I talked about 4 different methods that aim to be zero-shot and work across multiple domains and achieve generality in the way foundation models should. So zero depth for zero-shot metric depth, tag for tracking anything in any domain, refine for modeling 3D shapes, and then VDCD for understanding these video transformers. Finally, I want to take a second to thank many of my collaborators, and